The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like trapped insects, a sound Katie Rodriguez had learned to filter out 3 months ago. She did not look up from the 4 lines she was threading into the elderly patient's arm, a 68-year-old named Harold with pneumonia and trembling hands. The needle slid in with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times, maybe more. Her hands did not shake. They never did anymore. Cedar Creek Medical ER on a Tuesday morning smelled like stale coffee, antiseptic, and something underneath, the copper edge of old blood that the housekeeping crew could never quite scrub away. The trauma bay was quiet. The monitored beds hummed their steady rhythm. And in the corner office with the glass partition, Dr. Pierce was reviewing charts with the deliberate posture of a man constructing an argument. Katie had been here 91 days. She counted. She had kept her head down through the orientation period, through the first double shift that left her feet screaming, through the staff meeting where the senior nurses sized her up and decided she was quiet enough to ignore. That was fine. Invisibility was a skill she had mastered in other lives, in other countries, in circumstances that felt impossible to reconcile with the steady beep of heart monitors and the smell of hand sanitizer. She wore scrubs like everyone else. Navy blue. No name tag with rank. No insignia. Nothing that suggested she had ever been anything but a nurse who had arrived in Denver with a credential file that was technically accurate and completely false. 2 years at a community college program in Albuquerque. References from people who no longer existed. A social security number that was new enough that it did not trigger any flags. The military had been very thorough when they erased Captain Katie Rodriguez. She had watched them do it. The old flag was still in her apartment. Folded into a triangle the way they did it at Arlington. It sat on her nightstand in the studio on Brighton Boulevard, underneath a lamp that cast everything in amber. That flag was from Sarah Chen, her medic. Her sister in a different uniform, in a different desert, in a different lifetime. The extraction from muscle had gone sideways. There had been a buried IED. Sarah had taken the fragmentation meant for the convoy. Katie had held her hand for the last 30 seconds, and then the operation was classified retroactively and she was told that everything she had been, every rank, every citation, every scar, had never happened. Captain Rodriguez does not exist. If you surface, you will endanger every person who served with you. The message had been clear enough. So she threaded 4 lines and checked vital signs and stayed invisible. Rodriguez. The voice came from behind her. Dr. Pierce. He did not use first names with the nursing staff, not with the ones he had decided were beneath his notice, and especially not with the ones he had marked for a different purpose. Katie finished securing the line with tape, checked the flow rate, and turned. Grand rounds in 20 minutes. Bring the chart for bed 4. She nodded. Did not speak. Speaking was a choice that had consequences. Bed 4 was Marcus, a 44-year-old with chest pain that had presented as angina but refused to resolve cleanly. Katie had flagged an unusual EKG pattern 2 days ago, a subtle ST depression that the resident had initially missed. The chart notation was careful, precise, almost invisible. She had learned to write that way too. Do not make yourself louder than necessary. Do not position yourself where the light lands. Grand rounds at Cedar Creek Medical happened in a specific configuration. The attending physician stood at the head. The residents arranged themselves in a semicircle, clipboards held like shields. The nurses occupied the space at the back, near the door, where they could be called upon but not heard unless addressed directly. Dr. Pierce had been here 7 years. He had published 43 papers. He had trained 200 residents. He had also, in Katie's observation, never said a word to the nursing staff that was not designed to establish a hierarchy. Today would be different. This patient presented with classic angina symptoms, Dr. Pierce began, his voice carrying the tone of a man teaching a masterclass. However, the initial workup was incomplete. Dangerous assumptions about presentation led to delayed diagnosis. He turned his gaze to Katie. Not to the chart. To her. Our newer staff sometimes confuse pattern recognition with competence. They see textbook symptoms and forget that medicine is an art practiced by those with appropriate training. The residents did not move. The room held its breath. The nurse documented an EKG pattern inconsistency. He said the word nurse the way someone might say an amateur. This was flagged as, and I quote, unusual and atypical presentation. These are terms used by people who do not have the training to make accurate assessments. Pattern recognition without medical understanding is simply, he paused, looking directly at her now, dangerous improvisation masquerading as competence. Katie's jaw tightened. 1 millimeter. Enough to activate the small muscles along her temple. She kept her hands folded in front of her. Kept her breathing even. Kept her eyes on the wall behind him. Rodriguez, you wrote this note. Walk us through your clinical reasoning. The words came out measured, quiet, the voice of someone who had been trained to operate in environments where a raised tone could trigger an avalanche. The ST depression was most pronounced in leads 2, 3, and AVF. Inferior territory. Inconsistent with the patient's presentation history. A typical distribution pattern suggested posterior wall involvement, which would have been missed with standard workup. One of the residents looked up. Something had changed in her tone, though she could not have said what. It was the voice of someone describing a technical problem with no emotional weight attached to it. And what is your medical training, exactly? Dr. Pierce asked. His smile had the quality of a predator's. Walk us through your credentials. RN licensure. Colorado Board of Nursing. Community college program. Each phrase was clipped, professional, stripped of anything that might suggest she was defending herself. 2 years clinical experience. Which is why, Dr. Pierce said to the residents, we verify everything the junior staff puts forward. The unusual becomes routine when you lack context. The instinctual becomes reckless. This is what happens when we prioritize enthusiasm over qualification. He moved to the next patient. The residents followed like pilot fish. The rounds continued. And Katie stood against the wall, her hand steady, her breathing normal, her face a flat plane that reflected nothing. But that was not the worst part. Later, at the vending machine, Katie was feeding dollar bills into the slot for bottled water when Dr. Pierce appeared beside her. The hallway was empty except for the hum of the machine and the distant sound of the ER beyond the double doors. He was alone. That was the calculation, she realized. He was making sure there were no witnesses. I hope you're not offended, he said, his voice pitched low and casual, the tone of a man making conversation. It's nothing personal. But someone with your limited credentials needs to understand the scope of what you don't know. Basic pharmacology, diagnostic patterns, the kind of education that takes time and actual medical training. I wouldn't expect you to understand that. Katie retrieved her water. The bottle was cold in her hand. Do you know what your problem is? He was smiling. This was the part he enjoyed, the moment when someone was supposed to flinch. You think you understand medicine because you've read a few charts. You think you're observant. But observation without training is just guessing. It's the guessing that kills patients. She opened the water bottle. Took a drink. The chill of it was real, tangible, something to feel besides anger. I'll be watching your work very carefully from now on, he said. Making sure you don't hurt anyone with your improvisation. Katie turned to look at him. Not with anger. Not with defiance. With the absolute absence of reaction. A wall that did not bend. Is there anything else, doctor? The smile faltered. Just for a moment. He had expected something, a defensive response, an emotional reaction, some sign that he had gotten under her skin. The flatness of her gaze seemed to confuse him. No, he said finally. That's all. She walked back to the ER without hurrying. The water was already warming in her grip. That night, in her studio apartment on Brighton Boulevard, Katie sat on the edge of her bed in darkness. The city lights filtered through the blinds in thin gold lines. She held the folded flag in her hands. Triangle creased. Perfect. Exactly as they had delivered it. Sarah's flag. The only piece of that life she had permitted herself to keep. She thought about the presentation in grand rounds. The controlled atmosphere. The careful construction of doubt. He was building something, she realized. Not just professional jealousy. He was establishing a narrative. Incompetence. Recklessness. Someone who did not belong in this environment. The kind of foundation that could support a structure of very specific accusations later. Katie had been trained to recognize patterns in hostile environments. This was a hostile environment. The fluorescent lights and the monitors and the careful hierarchy of the hospital, it was just another theater for the same dynamic. Someone in power. Someone he had decided was a threat. And the systematic dismantling of credibility before the actual move. She set the flag on her nightstand. Looked at her hands in the darkness. Steady. Always steady. Somewhere outside, the city hummed with the rhythms of normal life. People who had one past. One identity. One story that remained constant. Katie had learned to live in fragments. To answer to a name that was not hers. To possess a skill set she was supposed to deny. To stand in grand rounds while a man positioned her as a cautionary tale. The water bottle sat empty on her nightstand. She had finished it without tasting anything. That was fine. Hunger and thirst were information that could be processed later. Right now, there was only the certainty of what was coming, the way a needle decompression waits for a collapsed lung to give it permission to function. She did not know how long she sat there. Long enough for the city to shift through another hour. Long enough for the anger to pass through her like a storm system and settle into something else, a kind of readiness that had no name in civilian medicine. But the flag was there. Sarah's flag. Folded and waiting. A reminder of what happened when you let someone see what you were actually capable of. It would not happen again. 3 months at Cedar Creek Medical, and Katie had learned the architecture of invisibility. Show up early, leave late, keep her head down, and never, ever, give Dr. Pierce another angle. The folded flag sat in her apartment under a stack of sweatshirts, wrapped in plastic from the honor guard ceremony she'd watched from 3 rows back, careful not to draw attention. Sarah Chen's flag. The only piece of the before life she'd permitted herself. Everything else had been erased. Records incinerated. Official channels shuttered. Captain Katie Rodriguez no longer existed on any database, any roster, any manifest. The Pentagon had made that abundantly clear, surface and endanger everyone. Stay buried and live. But staying buried was getting harder. Dr. Pierce had developed a rhythm to his assault, and it was working exactly as designed. The vending machine was in the west corridor, past the break room where the day shift was wrapping up. Katie had timed it carefully, for 52 p.m., when most of the residents had cleared out, when the hallway traffic thinned to stragglers grabbing energy drinks and granola bars. She'd made the mistake of assuming she could be alone for 90 seconds. She was inserting coins when his shadow fell across the fluorescent glow of the machine. Dr. Pierce. Tall. Sharp suit that cost more than her monthly rent. The kind of face that had never been told no, not once in 43 years of breathing. He leaned against the adjacent wall, arms crossed, smile thin as a blade. Pretzels? His voice carried across the empty corridor. Interesting choice. Most people with your credentials grab the protein bars. But then again, most people with your credentials didn't get hired by a community hospital after washing out of 3 nursing programs. 3 words, washing out. Not true. Separated. Discharged. Medical honorable status buried so deep that the fabricated nursing school record, perfectly constructed, government-forged, unverifiable, was the only reference anyone could find. And he'd clearly found something wrong with it. His eyes had that satisfied glint. Katie's hand stopped on the pretzels. She didn't turn. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, the only muscle in her body that disobeyed orders. I'm curious, he continued, and now she could hear the smile in his voice. The confidence of a man holding cards he knew were winning. How does someone with your limited credentials understand basic pharmacology? I mean, truly understand it. Not memorize it from some online certification. Actually comprehend the complex interactions between cardiac glycosides and electrolytes. Because in my experience, nurses with backgrounds like yours, gaps that long, files that thin, they tend to rely on pattern recognition and luck. Not science. Two nurses from the day shift rounded the corner, their eyes finding Katie, then bouncing away, suddenly fascinated by their own shoes. The corridor suddenly felt smaller. The fluorescent lights above hummed their mechanical song, hummed and hummed, like insects trapped in plastic. Katie grabbed the pretzels. Turned back to the machine. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't react. Didn't flinch. Dr. Pierce laughed. Soft. Satisfied. I'll take your silence as confirmation. Don't worry. We'll sort this out soon enough. His footsteps echoed down the hall. Katie stood there with the pretzels in her hand, watching her reflection in the vending machine's glass. Pale. Still. A ghost looking back at a ghost. She'd survived worse. She had. But this was different. This wasn't enemy fire. This was the slow, methodical dismantling of the only life she'd managed to build. And there was no tactical solution for that. The real reckoning came 3 days later during grand rounds. 20 residents in the amphitheater-style section of Cedar Creek's teaching wing. Fluorescent lights throwing everything into harsh relief. The smell of antiseptic thick enough to coat the back of the throat. Dr. Pierce stood at the front with a projected chart on the screen behind him, and Katie recognized it immediately, her own notes. From the Martinez admission last week. The 47-year-old with the acute coronary syndrome and the presentation that mimicked pericarditis. This is an interesting case, Dr. Pierce said, tapping the pointer against the chart. A good example of why protocol exists. Why we follow established guidelines. Not because they're suggestions, but because they keep patients alive. He turned to her. Katie was standing against the back wall, as always. Barely visible. Nurse Rodriguez. Would you like to explain your reasoning here? The room's attention pivoted. 20 residents turned. 20 sets of eyes pinned her in place. Katie's voice came out measured. Flat. The patient presented with chest wall tenderness localized to the left costal margin. EKG showed sinus rhythm with normal ST segments. Troponin elevated, but clinical presentation suggested musculoskeletal etiology rather than acute MI. Elevated troponin, Dr. Pierce repeated, for the benefit of the residents. You decided to downgrade an elevated troponin to musculoskeletal pain. Based on what, exactly? Your gut feeling? Your mysterious nursing intuition? Based on differential diagnosis? Based on shortcuts? His voice hardened. This patient could have missed an anterior wall infarction if the attending physician hadn't reviewed your work. You understand that? Your nursing shortcuts nearly killed this man. Silence. The kind of silence that accumulates, layer by layer, until it has weight. Katie didn't argue. Didn't defend. Didn't point out that the EKG ruled out acute MI, that the troponin elevation was from demand ischemia secondary to dehydration, that the patient had gone home with NSAIDs and resolved within 48 hours with no intervention. Instead, she watched Dr. Pierce's face cycle through frustration, the tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth when she didn't crumble, didn't beg, didn't apologize profusely enough to satisfy his need for dominance. He turned back to the residents. This is competence masquerading as shortcuts. This is what happens when we hire people based on need rather than actual qualification. Take note, residents. This is what dangerous improvisation looks like when it survives long enough to stand in grand rounds. A resident in the front row exhaled, a tiny sound meant to be hidden but audible in the surgical silence. Almost a chuckle. Almost approval of the dissection. Katie turned and walked out. Her movement was smooth. Practiced. The kind of exit that belonged to someone who had learned, over years of training, how to move through hostile territory without drawing fire. Her badge clattered softly against her sternum as she pushed through the amphitheater doors. Behind her, Dr. Pierce's voice continued, explaining her chart like she was a case study in failure. It was the phone calls that accelerated everything. 3 days after grand rounds, Dr. Pierce moved his game to the institutional level. Katie didn't witness it directly, she only knew because the atmosphere at Cedar Creek shifted. Sudden conversations that stopped when she entered the break room. Whispered consultations between department heads. The kind of pressure that built in a hospital when administration had been activated, when favors were being called in. The IT director pulled her aside on Wednesday afternoon. Older guy, maybe 60. Markings that suggested military background, the way he carried himself, the precise way he shook hands, the gold ring on his thumb that looked military family issue. "I'm not supposed to tell you this," he said quietly, steering her toward the stairwell where cameras were sparse. "But I've got principles." Dr. Pierce has been making calls. Hospital board members. 2 of them owe him referrals, apparently. Lucrative ones. He's putting pressure on them to request a formal credentials review. Katie's throat tightened. Not visibly. Not where he could see. A review. State Medical Board investigator. He's also contacting your nursing school references. The ones from. He consulted a piece of paper. A program in Arizona. University of Phoenix online program, class of 2019. The carefully constructed lie. The paperwork that had been forged by people who knew how to forge things so completely that even forensic analysis wouldn't catch the seams. And now Dr. Pierce was pulling threads, calling people who didn't exist, discovering inconsistencies. His methodical, the IT director continued. Give him another week and he'll figure out those references aren't real. Then he escalates to the board, and the board has to do an investigation. Could get messy. I wanted you to know what was coming. Katie looked at him. Really looked. At the bearing that came from years of discipline. At the eyes that had seen things. Soldiers recognized soldiers, even when they were wearing different uniforms. Thank you, she said. For telling me. Semper Fi, he replied quietly, and she understood that he knew. Not everything. But enough. That night, Katie sat in her apartment with a folded flag in her hands. Triangle of fabric. 13 folds, each one precise, each one weighted with protocol and honor and the weight of a coffin she'd watched descend into Arlington soil. Sarah's flag. A memory of the before life that wouldn't stay buried. Dr. Pierce didn't know what he was chasing. He only knew he'd sensed prey that didn't respond the way prey was supposed to respond. That didn't break under humiliation. That continued moving with the kind of calm that belonged to predators, not frightened nurses with forged credentials. He was following a scent, pulling threads, calling in favors, building a case. And he had no idea that every thread he pulled, every favor he cashed, every call he made was bringing something towards Cedar Creek Medical that would change the entire architecture of the hospital's power structure. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that in trying to expose her, Dr. Pierce was about to trigger something that had been asleep for 9 years. Something that didn't exist anymore, officially. Something that had been ordered to stay dead. And when that something finally surfaced, nobody at Cedar Creek Medical, not the board members, not the investigators, not Dr. Pierce himself, would be prepared for what they'd actually been hunting. 3 days after Dr. Pierce filed his credentials review with the State Medical Board, a multi-vehicle pileup erupted on I-25 northbound during rush hour. 7 cars. For motorcycles. A delivery truck jackknifed across both lanes. The first ambulance arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 4:19 p.m., and the ER transformed into controlled chaos, the kind Katie had learned to navigate in field hospitals where the triage line stretched longer than hope. The intercom crackled. Code trauma incoming. ETA for minutes. Katie was already moving, stripping latex gloves and reaching for fresh ones when the double doors burst open and the first stretcher wheeled through. A 42-year-old male, conscious but gasping, obvious femur fracture, blood pooling beneath the sheet. Bay 3. Next. Then another. And another. The ER filled with the sound of monitors alarming in dissonant chorus, paramedics rattling off vitals like a liturgy nobody wanted to hear, nurses calling out bed assignments and 4 gauges. The 4th patient came through the doors not gasping but silent. Completely silent. A young man, maybe 30, his chest heaving in that particular way that meant his lungs weren't receiving air, not because he couldn't breathe in, but because the pressure inside his chest was preventing him from breathing out. Tension pneumothorax. The kind that killed people in minutes if nobody understood what was happening. Dr. Marcus Chen, the senior resident on duty, was already waiting in Bay 4. He took one look at the patient's distended neck veins, the tracheal deviation, the asymmetrical breath sounds that weren't actually there, and reached for the chest tube set up with the decision-making speed of someone who had trained for exactly this scenario. Except his hands were moving toward the wrong intercostal space. 5th space. Anterior axillary line. The textbook approach. The slow approach. The approach that left room for error when error meant someone stopped breathing forever. Katie was 3 steps away when she saw it. The tremor in Chen's fingers as he prepped the skin. The hesitation as he pressed the needle forward. Not from lack of knowledge, from having too much knowledge of what could go wrong. That paralysis between textbook and reality. She'd seen it before in brand new trauma surgeons, the moment when academic certainty collided with the weight of a human life balanced on a single decision. She moved. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just the way her body had learned to move when time became currency and hesitation was bankruptcy. 2nd space. Midclavicular line. It wasn't a request. Dr. Chen's head turned toward her with the expression of someone being interrupted during surgery, but Katie was already reaching for the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, her movements carrying the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this exact thing 17 times in Mosul and Baghdad and Kandahar when the medevac choppers were still 20 minutes out. Let me. 2 words. Spoken in a voice that had dropped an octave from the deferential nurse who apologized for everything. This was a different Katie, the one whose hands had stopped shaking years ago, whose muscle memory was written in muscle, not thought. Dr. Chen stepped back. He didn't argue. That was the thing about a voice that certain, it didn't invite negotiation. Katie's hands moved on their own. Alcohol prep. The antiseptic smell rising sharp and medicinal. Her fingers found the anatomical landmark with surgical precision, the 2nd intercostal space, midclavicular line, directly over the collapsed lung. The needle felt like an extension of her wrist as she drove it forward through the chest wall, through the parietal pleura, until the hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. The patient's shoulders dropped and his diaphragm finally expanded without fighting against its own cage. O2 sat. Her voice didn't ask. It commanded. 68, the tech called out, eyes locked on the monitor. Get me a hollowed pen. 14-gauge catheter. Nobody moved. The silence in Bay 4 was absolute, the kind of silence that happens when everyone stops breathing at the same time. Dr. Pierce stood beyond the glass partition with his phone already raised, the screen glowing against his face as his eyes tracked Katie's movements with the intensity of a man watching evidence assemble itself in real time. The pen appeared in Katie's hand. One of the nurses, Rodriguez, her name tag read, understood without explanation. Katie cut the barrel to length with surgical shears, crimped the catheter needle through the plastic tube, and secured it at the puncture site with the kind of practiced efficiency that belonged in a surgical theater, not an emergency bay. Sat climbing. 72. 76. The patient's eyes opened. Actually opened. Not the half-conscious fluttering of someone circling the drain, but full pupil dilation, awareness returning like a light switch. His chest rose and fell in the rhythm of actual breathing, air moving through his lungs instead of trapped against his ribs. 81. 85. 90. Katie's hand stayed steady as she applied occlusive tape and stepped back. The patient's color was returning. Pink instead of purple. The death-rattle desperation gone from his breathing. Stable. The word that meant he might see tomorrow. She didn't look at Dr. Pierce. She didn't acknowledge the phone still recording. She simply turned to the vital signs monitor and began the secondary assessment with the same methodical attention she'd been applying all along, as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if saving a life with an improvised airway was just another Tuesday in the ER. But Dr. Chen was staring at her hands. At the way her fingers moved with the precision of someone who had practiced this procedure hundreds of times. At the terminology that had come out of her mouth, not second intercostal space but the shorthand of someone who'd used it as routine vocabulary, whose brain had defaulted to the stripped-down language of crisis medicine where every word was data and every movement was mapped. The young nurse, Rodriguez, was watching too. Her eyes moving from Katie's face to her hands to the hollowed pen on the instrument tray, the evidence of a technique that didn't appear in American civilian nursing textbooks. Dr. Pierce lowered his phone. His expression had shifted from suspicion to something sharper. Something that looked like recognition of a truth he wasn't prepared to articulate. Katie continued her work. Pulse check. Pupil response. Motor function. The ritual of assessment that required no explanation. The patient was breathing. The patient had a pulse. The patient would live because of something that had happened in Bay for in the span of 90 seconds, the span of time it took for a pressure-trapped lung to expand, for oxygen to flood a starving brain, for a man to return from the edge and remember that his body could do what it was designed to do. Nobody spoke. The monitors beeped their mechanical rhythm. The ventilator hissed its measured breaths. The ER continued its orchestrated violence around them, other traumas demanding attention, other lives balanced on other decisions. And in the midst of the controlled chaos, Dr. Pierce stood motionless, watching Katie Rodriguez complete her charting with the composure of someone who had performed emergency procedures under enemy fire and walked away breathing, someone whose hands carried the muscle memory of survival in places where improvisation wasn't technique. It was gospel. What he didn't understand yet was that the video on his phone had just captured evidence of something far more dangerous than false credentials. Security walked her to the employee lot at 3:53 a.m., her badge already deactivated, the magnetic strip no longer responding when she tried one last time at the turnstile just to see. The guard didn't look at her. Nobody looked at her anymore. They'd emptied her locker into a cardboard box, the scrub she'd bought with her first week's pay, the hand sanitizer, the 3 energy bars she kept for double shifts, and underneath it all, folded into a precise triangle the way they'd taught her at Arlington, the flag from Sarah Chen's casket. She held it without moving for 13 seconds. Then she set it on top and walked to the parking garage alone. The rain started before she reached her car. Not the clean kind that washes things clear, but the kind that sticks, that makes you feel heavier. She drove without direction, just away from Cedar Creek, away from the lights and the monitors and Dr. Pierce's expression when she'd pulled the needle out of that man's chest and the room had gone completely, absolutely silent. Sinus rhythm. The monitor had said it. 3 words that meant she'd done it right, that her hands had remembered what her mind was supposed to forget, that somewhere in the muscle memory of her shoulders and wrists lived a captain who'd operated on the hood of a Humvee in Cedar City while rounds came through the canvas above her head. Mel's diner was empty except for a waitress who'd learned not to ask questions and a cook visible through the service window. Katie slid into a booth with her cardboard box beside her, pushed the coffee away after the first sip because it had gone cold somewhere between the parking structure and this place. The vinyl seat was cracked in 3 places. She could see herself in the window, ghost pale, jaw locked, eyes the color of a Tuesday morning in Kandahar. Not a nurse. Not anymore. Just a woman who'd saved a life and paid for it with every credential she'd built. The folded flag sat visible on top of the box. She'd known that would happen. Nothing in this box was private. Everything was evidence. Sarah had been her team medic, the one who called out vitals when Katie was operating, the one who'd held a kid's hand while Katie worked to stop the bleeding that wouldn't stop. Sarah was the one who didn't come home from Mosul. Sarah was the one whose casket was empty because there wasn't enough left to put in it. Katie's hand moved toward the flag. Almost grabbed it. Almost threw it into the garbage bin across the diner, just to stop carrying it, stop touching it, stop remembering that she'd been the one to volunteer for that extraction, that she'd been the one who made the call that went sideways. The diner lights hummed overhead. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a show nobody wanted to watch. She pulled her hand back. The military had erased her. Not killed her, they were more sophisticated than that. They'd simply made Captain Katie Rodriguez not exist anymore. The official record ended in 2016, when the Mosul operation got classified so high that even the Marines who'd been there had to pretend it never happened. 7 soldiers extracted. 2 missing. 1 killed in action. 1, Katie, never mentioned in any report, any briefing, any official account. The Pentagon had written her out of history and told her that surfacing, that claiming her own name, would compromise the operational security of everyone she'd served with. So she'd disappeared. Gone civilian. Become invisible. Learn to answer to a name that wasn't hers and smile when people called her just a nurse. 42 months of invisibility. And in 90 minutes, Dr. Pierce had pulled a thread that would unravel all of it. He'd seen the video. She knew he had. His phone had been out when she'd made the move, needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the way it was taught in 100 operating tents where the ceiling was canvas and the floor was sand. The way it was taught in the dark places where there were no second chances, no appeals boards, no peer reviews. Just living or not living, and Katie had made that call more times than she could count. Dr. Pierce had watched her hands move with the precision of someone trained by the worst possible teachers, and he'd recorded it. She reached for the flag again. Her fingers trembled. Not from fear. From something deeper. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, all the discipline of 22 years of military service holding back what she wanted to do, which was to walk back into Cedar Creek and ask Dr. Pierce directly how long he thought it would take to start asking the right questions. How many calls to the Pentagon would it take? How many calls before someone senior answered? And then her phone buzzed. Just once. A single notification lighting up the dark. Text from an unknown number. No words, just coordinates. Latitude and longitude. Coordinates for the parking lot she was sitting in right now, at Mel's Diner, at 3:51 a.m., in a city 2,000 miles from the last place she'd been supposed to exist. Her hand froze on the phone. Coordinates meant somebody knew where she was. Coordinates meant somebody had been watching. Coordinates meant the thread had already come fully unraveled, and what was about to happen next would be written in blood and federal clearance levels and the kind of silence that erases countries. She didn't move. Didn't call anyone. Didn't stand up or go to the door. In her experience, when coordinates arrived in the dark, the people they belonged to were already en route. The only question was how many of them, and what branch they represented, and whether they were coming to save her or bury her deeper. The rain was still falling. Her reflection in the window stared back at her with eyes that had seen too much to be scared anymore. The flag sat in the cardboard box. The coffee was cold. The diner was still empty except for the waitress who wouldn't look up when the military arrived, and the cook who would pretend to be focused on the griddle, and Katie Rodriguez who had spent 42 months trying to disappear and had apparently failed so completely that someone had just proven they could find her anywhere. The next sound wasn't wind. Wasn't rain. Wasn't the normal sounds of a city sleeping. It was the low percussion of rotor blades cutting through the 3 a.m. darkness, getting closer, getting louder, the kind of sound that meant helicopters were breaking standard civilian airspace protocols and nobody in Denver was authorized to stop them. She heard it before she saw it, that unmistakable chop 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 that lived in her bones from 100 insertions and extractions. The waitress froze. The cook looked up. The sound of helicopter rotors shaking the diner windows was the sound of her old life coming to collect its debt. Katie didn't move. She had been military long enough to recognize a retrieval when one was happening. She had been invisible long enough to know what came next. And in the cardboard box beside her, wrapped around the flag from Sarah Chen's coffin, she still had 3 seconds of normal life left before the doors opened and everything that she'd tried to burn away came walking through them in boots and dress uniforms, looking for a woman who officially didn't exist but who had just, by saving one Marine's life and betraying every protocol that kept her safe, announced her location to the world. The rain kept falling. The helicopters kept coming. And Katie Rodriguez sat completely still in a vinyl booth in Denver, holding on to the last moment before her old life and her new one collided at the speed of rotor blades, knowing that whatever happened next would either end her or finally, after 42 months of running, let her stop. The helicopters kept coming. And Katie Rodriguez sat completely still in a vinyl booth in Denver, holding on to the last moment before her old life and her new one collided at the speed of rotor blades, knowing that whatever happened next would either end her or finally, after 42 months of running, let her stop. The phone on the table buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Just coordinates and a timestamp. She didn't need to check the message twice. Those coordinates marked Cedar Creek Medical's roof landing zone. The timestamp was 12 minutes away. Someone upstairs had decided to stop waiting. Katie finished her coffee. Cold. Metallic. She set the cup down with the precision of someone placing a charge and walked out into the Denver night where rain had started falling sideways, hammering the pavement like applause from an audience that didn't know it was watching the final act. By the time the first helicopter touched down on Cedar Creek's helipad, Katie was already back in the hospital. Not in scrubs. In her clothes. The staff who'd watched security escort her out 90 minutes earlier didn't recognize her at first. The woman walking through the emergency entrance wasn't the invisible nurse they'd dismissed. She moved differently. Shoulders back. Eyes forward. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The ICU was chaos. A patient, Ramadi, the admissions board announced, 40-year-old Iraqi translator, multi-organ failure from a car accident that had happened in the parking lot of a federal building downtown. The doctors were moving fast but disorganized, barking orders that overlapped, nobody taking the lead. 3 nurses fumbled with arterial lines. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm but the oxygen saturation wouldn't climb past 81%. Katie stood in the doorway. Watched for exactly 4 seconds. Then she moved. The ICU staff didn't see her walk to the bedside. They felt her presence shift the room's entire pressure. Someone was suddenly in control. Arterial line is kinked, she said. Not a question. Reposition. Flush with 20 mils NS. The nurse at the bedside obeyed before thinking. The oxygen sat jumped to 86%. Potassium at 5.2. Push 10 units regular insulin with 25 grams dextrose. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. Commands delivered in the tone of someone who'd ordered surgical procedures in firefights. Ramadi's eyes fluttered open. Rolled toward her voice. And for one impossible second, his hand came up off the bed, trembling, reaching. His lips formed words so soft the ventilator almost swallowed them. Al-Malik al-Azraq, he whispered. The Blue Angel. Katie's hands didn't stop. But every muscle in her body went absolutely still. The translation hung in the recycled air. The Blue Angel. The name they'd called her in Baghdad when she was someone else. When she ran a field surgery team that saved 14 Marines in 72 hours while bombs walked around them like curious dogs. When her face was classified. When she was Captain Katie Rodriguez and the Pentagon had documents that proved it, documents that were supposed to burn, documents that were never supposed to surface because she was never supposed to exist again. Ramadi's eyes closed. But his whisper continued, I knew. I knew it was you. Even in the ER. I knew. Katie finished the line placement. Step back. And that was when Sergeant Major Webb appeared in the ICU doorway. He wasn't in uniform. He was carrying something wrapped in navy cloth. A framed citation. His presence filled the space like a door opening on a different reality. "I believe this nurse just saved someone's life," Webb announced. Not loud. Not commanding. Just stating fact. "And I believe you all should know who you're looking at." He held up the frame. "Read it aloud." The words moved through the room like shrapnel, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Baghdad. Field surgery under direct enemy fire. 14 wounded Marines evacuated. Silver Star for Valor. Bronze Star with Valor device for. "That citation is fraudulent," a voice cut through. Dr. Pierce. Shouldering through the gathering staff with his phone already raised, already recording. "This woman does not have a military background. She has no credentials. She's a fake. A fraud. I have documentation from the State Medical Board questioning everything about her background." "The State Medical Board has already been contacted," another voice said. Measured. Final. The ICU doors slid open and a two-star general walked in wearing dress blues with a Pentagon courier trailing behind him, both of them moving like gravity itself bent to accommodate their path. Captain Rodriguez was operating under National Security Directive 47 Black. Her identity was classified at the highest levels. Until this moment. The general looked at Katie. Looked at the citation in Webb's hands. Looked at Ramadi in the bed, alive, because hands that had held a scalpel in a combat hospital had just adjusted an arterial line with surgical precision. "Your service record is fully reinstated, Captain. Welcome back." Dr. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again without sound. His face had gone a color that wasn't in the medical textbooks, the kind of pale that meant someone was watching their entire worldview collapse in real time. He'd spent for months building a narrative about a fraudulent nurse. He'd called in board favors. He'd contacted references. He'd weaponized procedure against someone whose credentials were literally classified by the federal government. And he'd recorded evidence of his harassment on his own phone like a man leaving fingerprints at a crime scene. "Security," the general said quietly. "Please preserve Dr. Pierce's device. And please inform him that any attempt to delete footage, manipulate records, or contact the board regarding this matter will result in federal charges." But Dr. Pierce wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had locked on the ICU monitor, on Ramadi's sinus rhythm climbing steady and strong, on the oxygen saturation holding at 94%, on the physical evidence that the person he'd spent months humiliating had just saved a life using skills that made every credential in his office look like a diploma from a cereal box. The general turned to Katie. "We need a statement. And we need to speak with your IT department. We have reason to believe Dr. Pierce attempted to access classified files during his background search on you. We'll need security footage from the past 72 hours. It was Marcus Vaughn, Cedar Creek's IT specialist and a Navy vet with 16 years of submarine service, who delivered the report to the hospital board 3 hours later. Every frame preserved. Every deletion attempt documented. Every attempt to manipulate patient records captured in triplicate. Dr. Pierce's phone had tried to purge its history at 11:43 p.m. By 11:44 p.m., a backup server in Littleton had already secured copies of every file, every search, every contact. Dr. Pierce had built his case against Katie with the same precision she'd used to build her invisible life. Which meant his case was airtight evidence of his own destruction. 6 months later, Katie stood in her office on the 3rd floor of Cedar Creek Medical, watching through the window as Dr. Pierce loaded boxes into a medical supply van in the parking lot below. Rural Colorado route, the termination notice had read. No license. No hospital privileges. No future in anything adjacent to patient care. His name tag read Steve on the supply van manifest, and when a passing orderly had offered to help him load boxes, he'd flinched like the word doctor might physically hurt him. The folded flag hung on Katie's wall now, displayed in a shadow box beside her framed commission and a photograph of Sergeant Major Webb's grandson, alive because a 40-year-old translator had recognized the hands that saved his life, alive because sometimes ghosts came back exactly when the living needed them most. The trauma alert came through at 2:13 p.m. Multi-vehicle collision on I-25, northbound, multiple priority ones inbound. Katie stood up from her desk, pulled the elastic from her hair, and walked toward the ER. The staff parted for her without being asked. Not because she was terrifying, though she was. Not because she was famous, though her story had leaked through Denver's medical community like blood into saline. They parted because they finally understood what they were looking at. Competence. Real competence. The kind that didn't announce itself. "Talk to me," Katie said as she moved into Trauma Bay 1. The team's eyes locked on her. 20 seconds ago they were disorganized. Now they had a leader. "What do we have?" And Captain Katie Rodriguez, the nurse, the Marine, the Blue Angel, the woman who'd spent 42 months invisible, began her work. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The restraint of someone who'd been asked to disappear and had finally, impossibly, been allowed to reappear. The restraint of someone who'd chosen scrubs over medals, chosen saving lives over vindication, chosen to let her work speak instead of her rank. Pain is information. A reminder that she was finally, actually, impossibly home. We appreciate every one of you watching. Please hit like if you're enjoying this, subscribe if you want more stories like it, and leave a comment telling us where you're tuning in from.